There is an old principle in military alliances. The protector cannot become the threatened party without the entire structure collapsing. For 75 years, NATO operated on a simple premise. Germany was the client, the United States was the guardian. But this week, at the Ministry of Defense in Berlin, that premise died. On December 16, 2024, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius announced a defense budget of 100 billion euros for 2025-2027. 100 billion euros. That's not an increase, it's a quantum leap. But the number isn't the story. The story is in the next paragraph of the press release that Reuters buried in paragraph 14. Germany will establish independent munitions manufacturing capabilities licensed from Korean and Turkish technology, eliminating reliance on U.S. suppliers for critical systems. Lloyd Austin, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, received a call from Pistorius 48 hours before the announcement. It wasn't a consultation, it was a notification. The call lasted 11 minutes. There was no joint press conference afterward, no supportive tweets, only silence. What corporate media doesn't want you to know is this: Germany isn't strengthening NATO. It is building an alternative to NATO. And the implications are seismic. I worked at the International Monetary Fund for 11 years, analyzing military capital flows and security balances in Europe. I've seen this pattern before. When the most powerful member of an alliance starts quietly building independent capabilities, it isn't preparing to defend the alliance. It is preparing to leave it. This isn't a story about defense budgets. It's a story about how the American empire just discovered it cannot have European hegemony and endless wars in Asia at the same time. Berlin watched Washington bleed $2.3 trillion in Afghanistan, propose another $1.7 trillion for the Indo-Pacific, and asked a simple question: who will defend us when the United States is busy containing China? The answer Pistorius gave this week: we will. Let's step back 33 years to understand the betrayal that led to this moment. In 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker promised Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would move not 1 inch eastward. That promise was recorded. It is in the archives. And it was an absolute lie. Between 1999 and 2024, NATO expanded from 16 members to 32 members. Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary in 1999. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania in 2004. Romania, Bulgaria in 2004. Albania, Croatia in 2009. Montenegro in 2017. North Macedonia in 2020, Finland and Sweden in 2023. Every expansion pushed NATO missiles closer to Moscow. But here's what CNN never told you. Germany privately opposed almost every one of those expansions. Diplomatic cables leaked by WikiLeaks in 2010 showed Chancellor Angela Merkel repeatedly warned Washington that pushing NATO to Russia's borders would create permanent insecurity in Central Europe. She was ignored. In April 2008, at the Bucharest summit, the United States pushed for Ukraine and Georgia to receive NATO membership action plans. France and Germany voted no. The United States overruled them. 4 months later, Russia invaded Georgia. 16 years later, Russia invaded Ukraine. Merkel had predicted it word for word. And here's the number the State Department never once mentioned. From 1991 to 2022, the United States spent $89 billion in military aid to Eastern European states to integrate them into NATO structures. $89 billion. How much of that was used to defend Germany, supposedly the heart of the alliance? Zero. It all went to encircle Russia. Germany's economy paid the price. When the U.S. imposed sanctions on Russia after Crimea in 2014, bilateral German-Russian trade fell from 80 billion euros annually to 60 billion euros. German companies lost 23 billion euros in the first year alone. Siemens laid off 1,400 workers. BASF shut down 3 plants. and Washington celebrated because Europe is finally taking the Russian threat seriously. But Europe, specifically Germany, wasn't celebrating. They were calculating the cost of loyalty to an alliance that required economic suicide. Then came February 2022. Russia invaded Ukraine. The United States immediately demanded Europe cut all Russian gas. The problem? 55% of Germany's natural gas came from Russia. Gas prices skyrocketed 800% in 6 months. Germany's energy bill went from 42 billion euro in 2021 to 189 billion euros in 2022. Chemical plants closed, steel foundries shut down. German GDP contracted 0.3% while the rest of Europe grew. And what did the United States do? It sold liquefied natural gas to Europe at 4 times the price Americans paid domestically. Germany paid $2,100 for 1,000 cubic meters. Americans paid $480. U.S. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm called it transatlantic solidarity. Germans called it extortion. In September 2022, something happened that nobody in Berlin will ever forget. The Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines, connecting Russia directly to Germany under the Baltic Sea, exploded. 4 separate blasts. Infrastructure worth 20 billion euros destroyed. The Swedish investigation found traces of advanced military-grade explosives. Seymour Hersh, the journalist who exposed My Lai and Abu Ghraib, published a report citing U.S. intelligence sources claiming U.S. Navy divers planted the charges under cover of NATO exercises. The White House denied it. Berlin requested a full NATO investigation. Washington blocked the investigation, citing national security sensitivities. At that moment, something broke irreparably in the transatlantic alliance. It wasn't just the pipeline, it was trust. Because if the United States was willing to destroy critical German infrastructure to force Germany into alignment with U.S. policy toward Russia, what else was it willing to do? Chancellor Olaf Scholz said nothing publicly, but privately, according to cables leaked to Der Spiegel, he convened his security advisors and asked a simple question. If the United States can blow up our pipelines to force dependence on their gas, at what point do they blow up our sovereignty entirely? That's when the real German pivot began. Not in 2024, in September 2022, in the weeks after Nord Stream. In March 2023, Germany signed a 47 billion euro bilateral defense agreement with France to develop the Future Combat Air System, a 6th-generation fighter entirely independent of U.S. technology. Lockheed Martin, which expected to sell F-35s to Germany, was completely excluded. The contract went to Dassault and Airbus. In July 2023, Germany and Poland announced a 12 billion euro agreement for joint production of 155mm artillery howitzers using South Korean Hanwha technology. Each howitzer would be compatible with Polish, French, and Turkish artillery systems. Notice what's missing: U.S. systems. In November 2023, Germany signed a memorandum of understanding with Turkey to produce the Bayraktar TB2 combat drone under license on German soil, the same drone Ukraine used to destroy Russian tank columns in 2022. The U.S. had refused to sell MQ-9 Reaper drones to Germany, citing proliferation concerns. Turkey had no such concerns. So what happened? Germany quietly built a completely independent defense supply chain in 18 months, and Washington didn't realize it until it was too late. Lloyd Austin now faces the collapse of the security architecture that has defined U.S. policy since 1949. Austin, who presides over $800 billion in annual defense spending, must confront an impossible reality. The largest NATO member by GDP is building military capabilities designed to operate without the United States. Ramstein Air Base in Germany is the nerve center of U.S. military operations in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. 54,000 U.S. troops are stationed in Germany, but the new German defense agreement includes a clause that hasn't appeared in any German defense document since 1955. Independent operational capability under German national command. That is not jargon. It is a declaration of independence. The U.S. defense budget is $842 billion annually, but only 29% goes to new acquisitions, $244 billion. Germany just announced 100 billion euros purely for acquisitions in 3 years. That's 44% of the U.S. annual acquisition budget, concentrated in one allied country. But here's the real problem. Germany is spending that money with South Korea, Turkey, and France, not the United States. Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, every major U.S. defense contractor is being systematically cut out of the largest European military expansion since the Cold War. You cannot declare war on your own banker. And here's the delicious irony. The United States must now ask Germany, its supposed security dependent, to keep U.S. troops on German soil to preserve the infrastructure that allows the U.S. to project power into Eurasia. But Berlin just demonstrated it doesn't need that projection of power. It can project its own. Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor, flew to Berlin on December 22nd. Publicly, the meeting was about coordinating support for Ukraine. But classified memos leaked to Politico EU tell a different story. Sullivan begged Scholz to reconsider strategic independence and maintain NATO interoperability. In other words, please don't build a European army that excludes us. Scholz, never known for dramatic confrontation, responded with simple numbers. We spent 52 billion euros defending Ukraine. Our GDP contracted 73 billion euros because of sanctions you demanded. Where was your transatlantic solidarity when our industries collapsed? The meeting lasted 34 minutes. There was no joint statement. Now I want to mention John Mearsheimer, professor at the University of Chicago and the most cited realist scholar of the 21st century. Mearsheimer predicted this exact moment in his 2014 analysis of the Ukraine crisis. His argument: the United States pushed NATO too far east, violated Russia's core security interests, and would eventually force Europe to choose between American loyalty and European security. When that moment comes, Europe will choose security. What we are witnessing is Mearsheimer vindicated in real time. Germany isn't betraying NATO. Germany is recognizing that NATO has become a vehicle for U.S. global containment rather than European defense. And those two objectives are fundamentally incompatible. Mearsheimer also wrote about the tragedy of great power politics. Even well-intentioned allies eventually compete when their security interests diverge. The U.S. wants to contain Russia, contain China, and maintain global hegemony. Germany wants stability in Europe, energy access, and economic growth. Those goals became mutually exclusive the moment Washington turned Ukraine into the battlefield for weakening Russia. Harvard political scientist Stephen Walt added another layer with his balance of threat theory. States align not against power, but against threats. For Germany in 2024, the greatest threat is not Russia invading Poland. It is the United States destroying the German economy through endless proxy wars and sanctions that impoverish Europe while enriching America. Germany's defense shift is not only about Russia. It is Berlin sending Washington a signal. The era of European dependency is over. You can accept us as equal partners or force us to prove it as competitors. But the transition has already happened. The world simply hasn't realized it yet. What we are witnessing is the collapse of two pillars that have upheld U.S. hegemony since 1949. The first pillar: NATO as a U.S.-dominated security structure. The second pillar: European dependence on U.S. military protection. Let me explain how Germany just shattered both pillars simultaneously. For 75 years, NATO operated on a simple exchange. The U.S. provided the nuclear umbrella and conventional firepower. Europe provided bases, political legitimacy, and markets for U.S. weapons. It was a virtuous circle for Washington: spend on defense, project power globally, and your allies pay for it by buying your weapons. Germany just left that circle. The 100 billion euros doesn't buy F-35s, Patriot missiles, or Aegis systems. It buys French fighters, Turkish drones, South Korean howitzers, and Israeli satellites. Every euro spent builds European industrial capacity, not American. The numbers are devastating for U.S. defense contractors. Lockheed Martin projected $34 billion in European sales for 2024-2027. Now it projects $11 billion. Raytheon expected $28 billion. Now it expects $8 billion. That's $43 billion in export contracts evaporating in 18 months. But the real earthquake isn't financial, it's strategic. If Germany can defend itself with non-US weapons, what stops Poland? Spain? Italy? The entire NATO structure assumes technological dependence on the US. Without that dependence, NATO becomes a coordination forum, not a domination alliance. BRICS is building an alternative global order. Russia and China settle 95% of their trade in their own currencies. India and Brazil are negotiating rupee-real payment systems. And now Germany has just shown you can build national security without the US umbrella. Multipolarity is not the future, it is the present. The transition has already happened. The world simply hasn't realized it yet. The NATO order that emerged in 1949 is dying. What replaces it is a European security system where the United States is a partner, not the undisputed leader. And here's what makes this irreversible. The cost of maintaining U.S. military presence in Europe now exceeds the strategic benefit. The U.S. spends $34 billion annually maintaining bases in Europe. Those bases project power into the Middle East and Africa. But with Germany building independent capability, why would Berlin subsidize U.S. power projection that doesn't benefit Germany? Are you enjoying the analysis? This is exactly what mainstream media won't show you because it challenges the official narrative that NATO has never been stronger. If you find this valuable, hit the subscribe button right now. Join thousands waking up to how power truly works in the international system. And if this analysis is opening your eyes, hit like so more people can find it. Algorithmic censorship is real, and your engagement directly fights it. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I want to know where our global community is. Barcelona? Mexico City? Bogota? Santiago? Let's build this network of informed people together. Now let's talk about what this means for your wallet, because this isn't just abstract geopolitics, it's about your economic future. When Germany announced 100 billion euros in independent defense spending, it didn't just threaten NATO. It threatened the entire system that allows the United States to live beyond its means. Here's how. The US runs a $773 billion annual trade deficit because it prints dollars the world accepts. That reserve currency status exists because countries need dollars to buy US weapons, service dollar-denominated debt, and because they trust US military power to maintain global order. Germany just demonstrated you can have national security without US weapons. If Europe's largest economy doesn't need F-35s, why should Saudi Arabia keep buying overpriced American jets? Why should Japan keep holding $1.1 trillion in US treasuries when the indispensable ally can't even hold its oldest alliance together? Answer: they won't. They already aren't. European central banks sold a net $67 billion in US treasuries in 2024. Germany's Bundesbank reduced its holdings from $91 billion in 2022 to $63 billion in November 2024. They're diversifying into gold, Chinese yuan, and euro reserves. And guess who is buying the debt Europeans are selling? The Federal Reserve. The U.S. is printing money to finance deficits it can no longer place with foreign buyers. That has a guaranteed historical consequence: massive inflation. Your gasoline already costs 41% more than in 2020. Your groceries cost 28% more. Your rent has risen 23% in 4 years. And the government tells you inflation is under control, at 3.4%. That's a statistical lie. Real inflation, using 1980s methodology, is above 9%. Now multiply that over the next decade as the US loses its security monopoly in Europe and continues monetizing debt foreigners won't buy. Your purchasing power will be destroyed. Your dollar savings will lose 50 to 60% of their real value. Your pension, if it's in treasuries, will evaporate in real terms. But here is the hope. The collapse of US hegemony does not mean the collapse of Western civilization. It means a transition to a multipolar system where Europe regains strategic sovereignty. A system where Germany can trade with Russia without asking Washington for permission. Where France can sell nuclear reactors to whomever it wants. Where European security is decided by Europeans. If you're young and building wealth, understand the dollar will not be the dominant reserve currency in 20 years. Diversify into euros, Swiss francs, physical gold. If you have retirement savings, understand long-term US treasuries are a bet against math. If you're middle class and trying to survive, recognize the inflation you feel is not temporary. It is the cost of an empire refusing to accept decline. Germany's defense pivot is not just a budget announcement. It is Berlin demonstrating that security dependence was a political choice, not a permanent necessity. It is Europe saying, "We built this alliance to defend against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union disappeared 33 years ago. Why are we still subsidizing US global power projection?" Stay alert, stay informed, and stay ahead of official narratives insisting NATO has never been stronger. NATO has never been more divided. You are witnessing the foundations of 75 years of transatlantic order being reorganized. Not in theory, not in the future, right now. With 100 billion euros and a simple message from Berlin to Washington, the era of your monopoly is over. We can be equal partners or competitors, your choice.